They called me just an old woman, and that was the moment I stopped correcting them. They said it softly, almost kindly, like the words explained why decisions no longer needed my input. I let it pass. Not because I agreed, but because I understood something they didn't. Labels make people careless. And careless people leave traces. My name is Margaret Hale, and for most of my life, no one ever had to remind me I was capable. I raised my son, Daniel, in a modest Ohio home where nothing flashy mattered as long as the bills were paid and the door stayed unlocked for family. I worked the front desk at a dentist's office for 27 years, balancing schedules, insurance calls, and people's tempers with a steady smile. Dependable women don't get applause. We get used. And I never minded that until being dependable quietly turned into being dismissed. When my husband passed, I told myself grief was something you learned to carry without spilling. Daniel was already married by then, building a life with Lauren, and I made myself small in their story because that felt like love. So when my knee surgery didn't heal right and Daniel suggested I move in just for a while, I agreed without hesitation. Lauren hugged me at the door the first day, warm perfume, bright smile, telling the neighbors how blessed she felt to have me close, how family meant everything to her. People nodded. They always do. Inside the house, the air felt tighter, like furniture that looks comfortable until you sit down. I told myself it was temporary. New house, new habits. I wasn't here to be a burden. I reminded myself of that often. The first changes came wrapped in concern. Meals adjusted without discussion. Salt quietly gone. Portions decided before I sat down. Doctor's orders, Lauren would say, tapping her phone like it carried authority I'd somehow misplaced. I didn't argue. Arguing turns concern into conflict, and conflict makes people defensive. Then my medication schedule shifted. Pills lined up neatly in one of those plastic organizers, clicking shut like a conclusion. Lauren started handing them to me herself instead of leaving them on the counter. Just helping you keep track, she'd say, smiling. Daniel nodded along, distracted, trusting. Trust comes easy when you're not the one being managed. Conversations started happening around me instead of with me. Questions meant for me were answered by Lauren before I could speak. Appointments booked. Forms discussed. My room reorganized while I was at physical therapy. Important papers moved to a hallway cabinet I didn't have a key to. When I asked where my bank statements were, Lauren smiled that polite, practiced smile and said, "Don't worry about that stuff, Margaret. We've got it covered." That word did a lot of work in that house. My grandson, Ethan, noticed before anyone admitted something was off. Children always do. He was 8, sharp, observant, already learning which voices carried weight. He started asking his mother before answering me, asking permission before sitting beside me. It wasn't cruelty. It was conditioning. I didn't correct him. Kids reflect the atmosphere they're raised in, and I wasn't about to turn myself into a storm. In public, Lauren was flawless. Church friends, school parents, even the mail carrier heard about how hard it was caring for me, how selfless she was. They squeezed my hand and told me how lucky I was. I smiled and thanked them because peace often costs silence. Inside the house, decisions continued without my consent. Daniel brushed off my discomfort with a tired sigh. "Lauren's just trying to help, Mom. You worry too much." Help is a clean word. It sounds generous even when it's taking something away. I stayed quiet, not out of weakness, but because silence gives you room to observe. Patterns emerged when I stopped reacting. Lauren never threw things away outright. She moved them, reframed them, adjusted the story so by the time I noticed, objecting felt unreasonable. My name appeared on paperwork in handwriting that wasn't mine. Money discussions happened near me, never with me. I felt myself shrinking in the family narrative, becoming a responsibility instead of a person. Then one afternoon, something small made everything clear. Lauren stood in the kitchen on the phone, laughing, telling someone how exhausting it was managing everything alone. Alone. I was 10 feet away, folding towels. She didn't lower her voice. Daniel walked past, heard her, didn't react. The house moved smoothly around me, efficient and quiet, and I realized I had already been edited out. I didn't feel angry. I felt awake. That night, lying in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of a house that no longer felt like mine, I made a decision. Not to confront. Not to explain. Not to beg for space in my own life. I decided to watch. To remember. To let people believe I was exactly what they'd labeled me. Because when they stop seeing you as a threat, they stop guarding themselves. And being underestimated, I learned, might be the most useful thing they ever gave me. By the time everyone else in that house believed things had settled, I already understood that something important had shifted. Nothing dramatic had happened. No doors slammed. No voices were raised. And yet the air felt heavier, like furniture had been rearranged while I wasn't looking. The routines stayed familiar, but the ownership of them quietly changed. Mornings moved faster without asking me how I felt. Afternoons were planned before I knew what they were for. Decisions were spoken out loud, but never to me. I was present for all of it, yet somehow no longer included. Lauren had mastered that balance. In public, she played the role flawlessly. She spoke gently, laughed easily, praised my cooking to neighbors even when she rarely let me cook anymore. She touched my arm when people were watching, the way caring women do when they want their kindness noticed. Everyone thought I was lucky. They said it openly. They said it often. What they didn't see was how kindness changed shape once the doors closed. It became structured, measured, controlled, care with rules, help with conditions. My meals arrived smaller, explained away with concern. Your digestion, she'd say, or the doctor mentioned salt. The doctor had mentioned nothing of the sort, but it didn't matter. Facts don't travel far when confidence delivers the message. My medications were rearranged into a new system I hadn't asked for. My purse was moved from where I always kept it. My mail began appearing already opened, already sorted, already summarized. When I asked a question, the answer came quickly, almost too quickly, like it had been prepared in advance. Andrew didn't notice. Or maybe noticing felt inconvenient. He trusted Lauren. He trusted efficiency. He came home tired, grateful that someone else was managing the details he didn't have the energy for. When I tried to explain small discomforts, things I couldn't quite name yet, he smiled that reassuring smile and told me not to worry so much. Lauren's got it handled, Mom. That sentence ended conversations before they began. Worry became my flaw instead of their warning sign. Ethan noticed before either of them admitted anything had changed. Children always do. He didn't treat me unkindly. That's what made it harder to name. He just adapted quickly. He answered questions for me at the grocery store. He reminded me of appointments I hadn't scheduled. He repeated rules Lauren had created as if they were facts that had always existed. His tone wasn't cruel. It was practical. Like the house itself, he was learning who mattered most when decisions were made. I realized then that disrespect doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it slips in wearing responsibility. I told myself to be patient. I told myself families adjust. I told myself I didn't want to be the kind of older woman who complains. I had seen how those women were described. Difficult, confused, emotional. I stayed quiet because silence still felt safer than being dismissed. But silence has a way of training people. The quieter I became, the easier it was for them to speak around me instead of to me. Lauren positioned herself between me and everything that required authority. Doctor visits became summaries instead of conversations. Financial questions were waved away before they finished forming. Once, when I asked about a utility bill I hadn't seen in weeks, she smiled and said everything was already taken care of, as if involvement itself was a burden I should be grateful to avoid. No need to stress yourself, she said. That phrase followed me everywhere. No need. No need. No need. With every repetition, my place in the house grew smaller. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by to return a dish. She looked at me, then at Lauren, then back at me again. You must feel relieved having someone take over, she said casually. The words weren't sharp, but they cut deeper than anger ever could. Lauren laughed and answered for me, telling her how we were all working together. The neighbor nodded, but her eyes lingered on me just long enough for something uncomfortable to pass between us. In that moment, I understood something clearly. My silence hadn't protected my dignity. It had helped rewrite it. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand explanations. I simply stopped correcting assumptions. When Lauren spoke for me, I let her. When Andrew believed everything was fine, I didn't interrupt. When Ethan repeated rules, I followed them without comment. Not because I agreed, but because I was listening now. Listening in a different way. I started paying attention to patterns instead of moments. Which decisions required discussion and which were announced. Which concerns were dismissed with affection and which were met with irritation. I noticed how Lauren's voice tightened whenever Andrew asked follow-up questions. I noticed how quickly she changed subjects when conversations lingered too close to my independence. I noticed which documents disappeared and which ones never reached my hands at all. I wasn't gathering evidence yet. I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I was simply learning the shape of the control that had wrapped itself around my life, so gently no one thought to question it. The house remained calm. Meals were eaten. Bills were paid. Smiles were exchanged. On the surface, everything worked. But beneath that smooth routine, something else was happening. I was no longer shrinking without awareness. I was choosing stillness. I was choosing patience. And when people believe you are harmless, they stop guarding themselves. They stop hiding their habits. They stop explaining their choices. That was the quiet advantage they gave me without realizing it. They thought they were managing me. What they didn't see was that I had begun to understand them. Once people stop asking for your opinion, they start editing your life without permission, and that truth settled over my days so quietly that even I didn't notice when it became normal. By the time part 2 ended, I wasn't hurt in loud ways anymore. I was being managed, smoothed out, handled like a loose thread someone meant to tuck away. I am Margaret, and I had already learned that silence keeps the house calm, but it also gives other people room to rewrite you, and in this phase of my life, that rewriting became procedural. Lauren didn't wake up angry. She woke up organized, and organization can be more dangerous than cruelty because it wears the mask of concern. She started with schedules, with gentle reminders, with phrases that sounded harmless but landed heavy, saying things like, "We should keep things simple for you," or, "At your age, consistency matters," and each time she said it, I watched how Andrew nodded without really listening. The way a tired man nods just to keep the peace. He wasn't cruel. He was busy, distracted, relieved that someone else was taking charge, and I realized something uncomfortable then, that neglect often hides behind gratitude. Ethan, my grandson, didn't change overnight either. He just adapted. Children adapt faster than adults because they read power before they read kindness, and soon he was reminding me to ask before opening the pantry, before adjusting the thermostat, before making tea the way I liked it. It wasn't disrespect the way people imagine it, no eye-rolling, no sharp words, just efficiency, like I was a process that could be optimized. Lauren never raised her voice. She raised systems. My medications moved shelves without discussion, my mail was organized into piles I hadn't agreed to, and my wallet started living in a drawer she said was safer. When neighbors visited, she smiled and said I was doing great, that she was just helping me rest, and they believed her because she sounded like every responsible daughter-in-law America has been trained to applaud. Behind closed doors, the help felt different. Meals came smaller, choices came fewer, and questions were answered before I finished asking them. I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I was still protecting the image of the family I had spent decades building. I told myself this phase would pass, that Andrew would notice, that Ethan would grow out of it, that Lauren's concern would soften, but instead patterns began stacking up like paperwork, and I started noticing details the way a woman notices weather changes before a storm. The way Lauren always spoke for me when doctors called, the way Andrew stopped asking me how I felt and started asking Lauren instead, the way Ethan learned which tone got approval. None of it was dramatic, and that's what made it dangerous. One afternoon at the pharmacy, the pharmacist asked me if I was comfortable with the refill changes, and Lauren answered before I could, her hand already reaching for the receipt, and the pharmacist paused just long enough to look at me, not accusing, not alarmed, just curious. That pause did something to me. It didn't scare me, it clarified me. I realized then that silence hadn't been protecting me at all, it had been making their story easier to tell. I didn't confront anyone, didn't demand explanations, didn't reclaim anything publicly. I simply began paying attention on purpose. I listened when Lauren repeated phrases about safety, noted when Andrew used the same language later without realizing it, watched Ethan mirror rules he hadn't been taught directly. I stopped volunteering information, stopped correcting assumptions, and started collecting moments, Not as evidence yet, just as understanding. At church, a volunteer asked if I'd been traveling less because she hadn't seen me at weekday services, and Lauren laughed lightly and said I preferred staying in now, and again that pause happened, the brief silence where someone waits for confirmation. I smiled and said nothing, and in that moment I felt the shift inside me, from endurance to clarity. Strategic silence is different from helpless silence. One drains you, the other steadies you. I began choosing myself in small ways that didn't trigger alarms, keeping copies of papers, memorizing numbers, reclaiming routines quietly. Andrew took my quiet as comfort, assuming everything was fine because I wasn't mentioning problems, and Lauren took it as compliance, mistaking my observation for agreement. They both underestimated the patience of a woman who had raised a family before they ever learned the word boundaries. There were no fights, no ultimatums, just time doing what time always does, revealing patterns to those willing to see them. By the end of this part of my life, nothing had exploded, but everything had tightened, like a system under pressure, and I understood with calm certainty that patience, when paired with clarity, becomes something else entirely. People often confuse comfort with kindness, and that confusion is where control hides best. By the time I understood that, the house had already learned how to move around me without asking. Lauren still smiled the same way in public, still spoke softly about how lucky Andrew was to have such a supportive wife, and how blessed Ethan was to grow up in a stable home. Neighbors nodded, church friends praised her patience, and doctors listened to her explanations before they looked at me. Behind closed doors, though, the tone shifted just enough to feel it, but not enough to accuse it. Decisions were already made when they reached me. Schedules were set. Appointments were confirmed. Groceries appeared with items I hadn't chosen. My preferences weren't denied, they were simply forgotten. Andrew called it efficiency. I called it erasure, quietly, where no one could hear me judge it. I stayed calm because calmness had always been my armor. I stayed quiet because peace had been my contribution to this family long before Lauren arrived. What changed wasn't my voice, but my attention. I started noticing how often Lauren answered questions meant for me, how she stood a little too close during conversations with outsiders, how she framed every decision as protection. She never said I couldn't do something. She said it might be too much for me. She never said I was incapable. She said she didn't want me to feel pressured. Concern, when repeated often enough, becomes a leash. Andrew didn't see it. He came home tired, grateful that someone else was managing things, relieved to outsource responsibility. When I stopped correcting small inaccuracies, he took that as proof everything was fine. Silence, to him, meant approval. Ethan learned faster. Children always do. He began asking permission for things he never used to ask about, checking Lauren's face before reacting to mine, measuring his tone the way kids do when they sense invisible rules. He wasn't unkind. He was careful. That hurt more than defiance would have. One afternoon at the clinic, the nurse paused while Lauren explained my symptoms. She glanced at me, then back at Lauren, then asked the same question again, slower this time. I answered myself. The room didn't crack open. Nothing dramatic happened. But Lauren's explanation ran longer than necessary afterward, and I recognized that sound. It was justification. At the pharmacy, the clerk asked if I wanted to review my refill schedule. Lauren stepped in automatically. I didn't stop her. I just waited. The clerk looked at me anyway. I nodded once. Small moments like that stacked up. Not confrontations, just pauses. Pauses have weight. They make people aware of patterns without naming them. At home, Lauren began tightening routines. Meals were earlier. Lights were dimmed sooner. My name appeared less often in conversations unless it was paired with my age. Andrew mentioned stress more frequently, not arguments, just a general tension he couldn't place. He asked if I was comfortable, if I needed anything. I said I was fine. That answer unsettled him because it no longer came with reassurance. I wasn't cushioning their emotions anymore. I wasn't adjusting myself to make the system smoother. I didn't announce boundaries. I practiced them quietly. I kept my own documents. I answered questions directly when asked directly. I stopped volunteering explanations. When a package arrived in my name, Lauren opened it out of habit, then froze and handed it over without comment. That pause told me everything. Habits don't hesitate unless someone feels watched. I wasn't watching angrily. I was watching clearly. Andrew overheard pieces of conversations, noticed how often Lauren spoke for me, sensed that something was off without knowing what to call it. Doubt doesn't start as suspicion. It starts as delay, as hesitation. She framed choices as necessities. Control, when threatened, becomes thorough before it becomes loud. I didn't rush. Time had shifted in my favor the moment I stopped trying to keep everyone comfortable. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't gathering allies. I was restoring balance by standing still. The house adjusted around that stillness whether it wanted to or not. Outsiders began addressing me first. Andrew began pausing before agreeing. Ethan began watching both of us instead of only one. Nothing had been exposed yet, but the structure was unstable now. And once a structure starts compensating for its own imbalance, it tells the truth on its own schedule. I had learned something important by then. When an older woman stops shrinking to fit the room doesn't explode. It recalibrates. And recalibration, once started, can't be undone quietly. The ending didn't arrive with an announcement or a confrontation. It arrived the way truth usually does when it's been waiting long enough, quietly, then all at once. By the time I understood that my silence had fully ended, no one was arguing anymore. There was nothing left to argue against. Lauren's careful structures had begun to lean inward, not because someone pushed them, but because they were built too tightly to breathe. What most people never realize about control is that it survives best in noise. It thrives in distraction, in urgency, in emotional chaos. Once things slow down, once people begin to look instead of react, control starts to feel heavy. Lauren had always been efficient. She planned ahead, spoke gently, anticipated needs before anyone voiced them. For a long time, that looked like care. Then one day, it started looking like answers arriving before questions, like solutions no one had asked for. That was when gravity took over. Andrew was the first to feel it, though he didn't name it right away. He missed a meeting he couldn't remember agreeing to. When he checked his calendar, the invite was there, accepted, archived, handled. He asked Lauren about it casually, half smiling, as if he didn't want to imply anything. She laughed, said she was just helping him stay organized. He nodded, but the nod didn't close the loop this time. It stayed open, unresolved, like a sentence without punctuation. A few days later, the bank called. They asked for confirmation on a change I hadn't authorized. Lauren wasn't home yet. I answered the phone myself. I didn't panic. I didn't accuse anyone. I asked the representative to give me a moment. My records were in order. The signatures didn't match my recent activity. When Lauren walked in, I handed her the phone without a word. She took it easily, the way she always did. But Andrew was standing there. He didn't step away. He listened. That was the shift. Not the bank, not the call, but the listening. Lauren explained smoothly. The representative thanked her. The call ended politely. But the room didn't reset. Andrew didn't rush to fix the silence. He didn't fill it with reassurance. He just stayed where he was, absorbing the space between explanations. After that, small things began to surface, not as accusations but as confirmations. The church coordinator called to clarify why I had declined a volunteer role I'd signed up for months ago. I corrected her gently. She apologized, embarrassed. Lauren overheard and smiled, but her smile lingered half a second too long. Andrew noticed. At the clinic, the nurse asked who should receive updates moving forward. I said my name. Lauren nodded, but her grip tightened. The nurse paused, then repeated the question. That pause said more than any confrontation could have. Ethan heard everything from the stairs. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Children learn early when something is being rebalanced. They feel it in the air. Over the next few days, he stopped asking permission for things he'd never needed permission for before. He reached for snacks without looking over his shoulder. He laughed louder. Healing doesn't always announce itself either. Andrew started asking questions, slowly, carefully, as if he were relearning how to speak to someone he'd assumed would always be fine. Not, is everything okay, but how do you want to handle this? Not, Lauren already took care of it, but did you want me to step in? And then one evening, without defensiveness or guilt, he asked the only question that mattered. What do you want? I didn't give a speech. I didn't revisit every hurt. I told him the truth in its simplest form. I said I wanted my decisions back. I said I wanted transparency. I said I wanted to be treated like a person whose consent mattered, not a responsibility to manage. He didn't interrupt. He didn't explain her intentions. He apologized, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that acknowledged the cost of his absence. Lauren didn't unravel. She adjusted, then realized adjustment wasn't enough anymore. Control needs isolation, and isolation had failed. Her kindness didn't disappear, but it lost its authority. It no longer operated by default. There were boundaries now. Processes changed. Accounts were restored. Preferences were updated. Conversations slowed down and began including pauses where my voice belonged. No one was punished. No one was publicly shamed. Life continued, just with corrected angles. That's the part people often misunderstand. Justice doesn't always look like loss. Sometimes it looks like access being returned to the rightful owner. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt quietly erased under the cover of concern, remember this. Patience paired with clarity becomes leverage. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need revenge to restore balance. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my value. And if you believe stories like this deserve space, stories where dignity wins without cruelty, please like and subscribe. Your support helps ensure these truths keep finding their way out of silence.